Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video of the Machine Quilting Party. Today we're quilting concentric circles, a really beautiful walking foot quilting design. It does tend to be just a tiny bit slow because we're going to break thread with every single circle we stitch. So let's get on the machine and I'll give you some tips for getting started. So I'm getting started with this design, and the first thing I want you to notice is the fact that I'm not starting in the dead center. I have marked these circles and I'm not starting with the smallest one because the smallest one is going to be both the hardest, the most time consuming, and the most potentially problematic circle of all of them. So for that reason, I like to start a little bit away from the center, and even with this one, which is about a 4-inch circle, it's still a little tricky. I have to go slow, take a few stitches, lift the foot. I'm lifting with my knee lifter, but you could also reach behind to lift the foot here, and just rotate and shift the quilt very slightly to stay on the marked line. Now, I don't want to have to mark every single circle, but if you really wanted your concentric circles to turn out just exactly right, that would be the way to do it, to make sure that they come out just exactly perfectly circular and evenly spaced apart. I'm going to try quilting the outer rings using the guide on my walking foot to space out the lines 1 inch apart. Got a little thread tail here from where I tied off my thread break from before. That's one other thing about concentric circles. We're going to have to break thread with every single line because we're quilting to complete the circle and we want it to be basically one solid ring. Now when I'm quilting this on a real quilt, sometimes I'll change it and turn it into what I call UFO, where you have kind of an escape hatch and you can quilt out of it and you don't have to break thread with every single line of stitching. But whenever I'm quilting it like this, where it's in a space, there's no stitches, there's no seam lines that would allow me to escape from it, it's kind of a whole cloth effect. In this situation, I'm always going to stop, break thread, tie off, and bury those thread tails in the middle layer of my quilt between every line of stitching. And please watch, I've got another video on this where I go into a lot of detail on exactly what I'm doing, how I use the cheater needle, and to tie that off securely. So definitely watch another video on how I do that. So now let's shift inside and we're going to quilt the smallest circle. And this is going to be tricky because it's going to be tight. The circle is obviously very circular. It's very small, which means I need to watch my direction changes. So I think I'm going to start with maybe every 2 stitches, lift the foot slightly and shift it over. This would be, of course, much easier to stitch using free motion quilting because my hands, I would just make a circular shape, obviously. With a walking foot, it's harder because the circle is so, it's such a tight, small shape. So in order to stitch this with a walking foot, you're going to have to go slow. You're going to have to take a few stitches at a time. I'm thinking like maybe right now I'm stitching maybe 3 stitches at a time and rotating consistently, continually shifting the quilt and rotating it round, so that way I not only stay on the line, but I also form a beautiful circular shape. If I was to stitch too many stitches in the same direction and not be carefully shifting things around, then I would end up with basically kind of a zigzaggy edge to my circle. It would not be this beautiful smooth circle shape. I would also likely end up with some ripply fabric here. So it's slow and steady wins the race. Slow and steady stitching, small direction changes. I'm lifting the foot very slightly. I'm shifting it very slightly. Just very subtle angle changes. If I was to dramatically rotate it around, then I would probably get kind of a jagged point look. Instead of a smooth circle shape. So it's just a lot of things to kind of pay attention to and to work on as you're stitching this design. This is I would consider this a harder design. It definitely requires more patience, more time, and more consideration of your stitching, particularly when you get the smaller and smaller circles in the center. An easier design by far would be Super Spiral, which is a spiral design where you start out tight in the center and it's slow in the center, but then the bigger and bigger the spiral gets, the easier and easier it becomes to stitch. So if you're looking for something that's maybe a little easier to quilt, try Super Spiral as well. So of course, thread break with every single circle. So I just make sure to leave myself long thread tails so I can tie them off and bury them in the middle layer of the quilt. And I do this with every single thread tail. Whenever I have a situation where I have, 2 thread breaks at the same place, which is like this, I don't tie all 4 in a knot and bury them. I tie 2 together and bury them, and then tie the other 2 together and bury them. And the reason is all 4 threads in one knot would make a very thick, bulky knot that would probably not bury itself in the middle layer of the quilt. So for that reason, I always do 2 threads together, and it makes a nice small knot, nice and secure, locks the threads together, and then buried in the middle of the quilt, it's not going to go anywhere. Now I have marked the next line of quilting, but I want to start using my guide and just kind of start seeing what that's going to feel like and knowing what that's going to look like whenever I start the next line of stitching. So I'm going to both be looking at the line that I've marked and also looking at the guide bar lined up with the previous line of stitching here, and kind of keeping an eye on both things at once. Sometimes I do this, sometimes I have something marked, but then I also use a guide bar or tape just to give me another reference point and help me set up for the next line of the design. Sometimes that's really useful. Now, obviously, this is much easier and a little faster because the circle has gotten bigger. It's another inch bigger than the one we started with. And actually, I should say it's 2 inches because we have an inch here and an inch on the other side. So it's significantly bigger, and that means that the circle shape itself is a shallower curve. And this is important. The smaller the circle, the deeper the curve. Remember, whenever we stitch curving lines, shallow curves are easier to quilt with your walking foot. You have less fabric shifting, you have less movement, you don't have to stop and rotate the quilt so much. And the same thing applies to a circle. The bigger the circle, the less you have to stop and shift it. As we stitch the bigger and bigger circles on this square, we will be able to just kind of smoothly stitch and rotate the quilt at once. We won't have to do this stop and shift move that kind of makes this a very much a stop-start feel, and it's kind of hard to get in the rhythm and form a pattern with this design, just to kind of get in the rhythm and be able to relax with it, because we're constantly having to stop and shift and move things around. As the circles get bigger, that definitely gets easier. So I'm going to tie off this thread tail and bury it, and I'll meet you back here when I've stitched a few more circles and share some tips for how to quilt this design as it gets bigger on your quilts. So I've taken a minute to stitch several circles, and as they've gotten bigger, they've gotten so much easier to stitch. So here you can see what I'm doing now. I'm lining up the guide with the circle from before, and I no longer have to stop and reposition. I can just let the quilt gently curve, and I'm just steering it through the machine. Another thing, I set the concentric circles up on my sandwich slightly off center, and that means that I've now hit the edges of my quilting space, so I can stitch off into the batting and break thread without having to worry about tying off and knotting my thread tails and burying them properly. So I'm just going to keep stitching here and go straight off the edge of the square and into the batting area, and that's going to be secured later whenever I go trim up my blocks and connect them together to create a quilt. And here's what it looked like whenever I finished concentric circles. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot quilting this design with me today. But of course, if you have any questions about this quilting process, please ask in the comments below. I really want to help you learn more about walking foot style quilting. Now, if you'd like to join in the fun and stitch out a new design with me every week and put them together into a bright, beautiful quilt, all you need to join this project is a copy of my book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. Inside, you'll find the 30 designs that we're going to be stitching out together, as well as the quilt pattern for the Marvelous Mosaic Quilt, so you know how to cut your blocks, how to trim them down, how to add the binding, all that good stuff. You can find the pattern in the book. And you can find the book at leahday.com/walkingfoot. So come and check it out and join in the fun of the Machine Quilting Party. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt!